The speeches of Job's friends. There was a man named Job. He was known for being good and kind. He lived in a peaceful place, with a large family and many blessings. But one day Job faced a great sadness. He lost much of what he loved, his children, his wealth, and his health. This sorrow was heavy on his heart. In those quiet moments of suffering, 3 friends came to visit Job. Their names were Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. They heard of Job's troubles and came to sit with him. They wanted to comfort him, but something more was about to unfold. At first, the friends sat quietly. They shared in his grief and did not speak for a long time. They wept, and they sighed, and they stayed near him. Then gently, Eliphaz began to speak. Eliphaz's voice was soft, like a calm wind through the trees. He suggested that perhaps Job's troubles came from a place of learning. He told of a dream he once had, where a mysterious voice whispered about human frailty. Eliphaz gently proposed that people suffer when their ways are not right, when they stray from goodness. He said, "Remember, no one is innocent before God. He is wise, and he watches over all people. Sometimes troubles are part of this watching." Eliphaz spoke with a peaceful tone. He wanted Job to reflect quietly on his ways, hoping Job might find comfort by seeing his troubles differently. After Eliphaz finished, Bildad spoke. His voice was aged and steady like the deep roots of an ancient tree. Bildad reminded Job of the long history of those who lived before him. He said that those who are good often find peace, while those who turn from goodness often face hardship. Bildad hoped to reassure Job by telling him that God's justice is true and sure. He said God does not forget the innocent. If your children have died, perhaps they were not blameless, but the innocent will always find hope in the end. His words, though firm, carried a quiet care. Then Zophar spoke. His voice was softer but carried a sharp edge, like a gentle breeze that stirs the leaves. He spoke more directly. He suggested that Job's sufferings might be even greater than Job realized, and that perhaps Job deserved even more. Zophar urged Job to turn to God with a humble heart, saying that God is merciful. Zophar's words were meant to bring Job to a place of honesty and change. He whispered gently about how God's wisdom is far beyond human understanding, and how Job might find peace by listening closely to that wisdom. After these words, Job listened quietly. The night was calm and the stars shone softly above. Job thought about what his friends had said. Each had spoken from a place of deep belief, though their words were not exactly the same. Their voices mingled like a soft chorus, each adding a different note to the quiet room. The friends hoped their words would bring relief, a resting place for Job's weary heart. But as Job sat there, he felt a mixture of feelings, some peace, some confusion, and much sadness. The journey with his friends' words was only just beginning. In this stillness, the story waits to unfold more gently, as if the night itself holds its breath, listening closely to what Job will say next. The speaking of friends is but the first step in a long, quiet conversation about sorrow, faith, and the search for understanding. And so, the voices of Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar linger softly in the air, like gentle whispers meant to soothe, to question, and to hope. The story continues, slow and gentle, like a lullaby told under the soft glow of the moon. The stillness in the room lingered after Zophar's words, the soft flicker of candlelight casting gentle shadows upon the walls. Job sat with eyes lowered, his spirit heavy yet quietly steadfast. The weight of his friends' speeches settled around him like a dense mist. Yet within that mist, a faint glimmer of hope flickered, a hope for understanding, a yearning for truth beyond pain. At last, Job's voice emerged, steady but layered with sorrow and deep thought. He thanked his friends for coming, for sitting with him when his world had fractured. Their presence had been a balm, even if their words had pricked more than soothed. Job wished they could see that he loved and feared God just as they did, that his heart was not hardened or blind. Job then spoke of the vastness of his pain, not just the loss of wealth or children, but of his very body aching under the cruel hand of illness. His words were fragments of the night sky, stitching constellations from shards of grief. He confessed the loneliness that grasped him tightly, when all around had turned away, when the laughter of family was only a memory. Yet, in the depths of his torment, he wrestled fiercely with faith, clinging to the invisible threads that bound him to the divine. Though his heart cried out in anguish, Job refused to accept the simple equations his friends suggested. that suffering was punishment, but he must have sinned. He questioned the fairness of his ordeal, the silence of heaven in his hour of need. It was not a cry of despair alone, but a search for wisdom, a reaching toward understanding in the darkness. Eliphaz listened, his brows furrowed in quiet reflection, but also with a touch of distress. He believed deeply in the order of the world, in the justice of God's hand. Yet hearing Job's words stirred something in him, an awareness that perhaps human suffering did not always fit neatly into the boxes of reward and punishment. Bildad's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. He too wrestled with the certainty of his beliefs. Might there be depths to divine justice that mortal minds could not yet grasp? Could Job's trials be a test not just of sin but of faith itself? Bildad felt a growing unease at the harshness of his own earlier words, a softening tempered by the gravity of Job's profound honesty. Zophar, known for his fiery insistence on truth, found himself quiet for a time. The sharpness of his earlier speech was muted by Job's courage and the humility woven through his lament. Perhaps wisdom demanded more than rigid judgment. Perhaps compassion must temper doctrine. The night deepened, and the friends sat once more in silence. Their hearts were heavy with questions, the kind that echo in the stillness long after voices falter. Together, they shared a fragile space where doubt and faith intertwined, where sorrow was neither condemned nor resolved but held gently like a fragile flame. Job's words had not dispelled suffering, but they had opened a new window, one allowing light to touch the edges of the dark, inviting a dialogue not only about blame or justice but about the very nature of existence and the mystery of divine love. As dawn approached, the friends felt the quiet strength that comes not from easy answers, but from the courage to face uncertainty, to listen deeply, and to remain present with one another amid life's most profound questions. The journey they had begun was far from over, yet in this moment, beneath the spreading light of early morning, a fragile peace whispered through the air. The speeches of Job's friends had stirred the soul's depths, awakening both challenge and hope, and tolling the wayfarers onward into the unfolding path of understanding. The silence between them lingered as the first pale light crept across the sky, softening the shadows that clung to each weary figure. The night had held their confessions, their doubts, their fears, and now the dawn brought the chance to see one another anew, not as adversaries, but as companions on a difficult path. Eliphaz broke the stillness gently. His voice was quieter now, less certain, stripped of the old certainties that had once so firmly guided him. "Job," he murmured, "perhaps the answers we seek do not come in judgments or swift truths. Maybe they arise in the patience we bear, and the questions we dare to ask without easy replies." Job looked up, his eyes reflecting the soft light of morning. For all the pain etched deep into his face, there was a subtle ease, as if a burden unseen but heavy had been lifted just a fraction. "Your words," he said, "touch a part of me I thought was long closed. To hold questions in open hands rather than clutching at blame is a new kind of courage." Bildad nodded, the lines of his face easing. "We have walked blind through our own fears," he said, "and in doing so we have sometimes stumbled over hope as well. What if our faith is not meant to be a fortress, but a wellspring, something that renews rather than protects?" Zophar remained quiet for a moment longer, then offered his voice, thinner and softer than before. "I once believed that wisdom came only through certainty. Now I sense it may come through wondering. The space between our understandings is vast, but maybe it is in that emptiness we find what is truly divine." In this rare moment of shared reflection, the four men were no longer separated by harsh words or misunderstanding. They had moved beyond the need to explain away suffering or to assign blame. There was no rush to fill the silence with platitudes or to demand immediate meaning from pain. Instead, they sat together, linked by the simple, profound act of being present. Job's gaze wandered toward the waking sky, where hues of rose and gold unfolded softly. In the quiet moments, he said, "I find a strange kind of solace. It is not the peace that comes from resolution, but from the presence of those who do not turn away. Your friendship, the very fact of your presence, is a balm I could not have imagined when this trial began." Eliphaz smiled faintly, eyes glistening. "And your endurance teaches us, Job, that faith is not a treasure to be hoarded in times of ease, but a light to carry through the darkest nights." Bildad added, "Perhaps the true measure of divine love is not found in the ease of our fortunes, but in the strength to endure when all seems lost." Zophar nodded, the shadows of his former harshness giving way to a gentler understanding. We may never grasp the full mystery, but in each other's company we find enough to move forward. The friends rose slowly, their bodies weary, but their spirits less burdened. They gathered what little they had, words of kindness, glimmers of hope, unspoken promises to return to the dialogue when strength allowed. They knew this journey was far from over. Job, though still marked deeply by suffering, carried within him a newfound grace, not the naive hope of quick answers, but a durable trust in the shared journey of seeking. His heart had room again for questions, for lament, for the possibility that love and justice might exist beyond human understanding. As they parted ways beneath the brightening sky, there was no certainty about what path each would take next, but the fragile peace they had found together was enough to carry them through the day. This moment of connection, brief and precious, was a reminder that even in the midst of hardship, there is a place where human hearts can meet, and in meeting, discover hope. The story of Job and his friends, woven with pain, doubt, and fragile hope, would continue. Yet now it carried a softer light, a gentle invitation to walk on, to listen more closely, and to hold space for the mystery that enfolds us all. The speeches had ended, but the conversation, silent, profound, and unending, had only just begun. As the days that followed unfurled softly like dawn mist, the rhythm of their conversations settled into a quiet cadence. There was no longer urgency to uncover sudden revelations or to hasten judgments. Instead, a steady, patient listening took root among them, a communion of souls marked less by proclamation and more by presence. Job, still cloaked in his sorrow yet shielded now by the gentleness of understanding, found a subtle strength in this shared silence. Eliphaz occasionally spoke, his voice less bold than before, weaving stories drawn not merely from ancient wisdom, but from the delicate nuances of human experience. He spoke of the patience that soils the earth, except the slow nurturing that gives birth to wildflowers, gifts that cannot be hurried. Answers, he said, are like seeds. They find their time, often when least expected. Bildad reflected often in imagery drawn from the natural world. He likened faith to a river, sometimes obscured by the storms and clouds, yet always flowing beneath, unseen but constant. It was a faith not of walls or barricades, but of endurance and flow. In his softened tone, one could hear the quiet tracing of hope beneath any cynicism that might have once hardened his heart. Zophar, once stern and unyielding, now spoke in a voice tinged with wonder. He mused on mystery itself, the thin veil between the known and the unknown. There is wisdom, he said, not in the clasping of certainty, but in the letting go, the gentle dance with absence. In those words lingered a humility that bound them all together in mutual searching. Job, absorbing these subtle shifts, felt the shadows that had pressed so heavily against his heart loosen their grip. Where before he had sought reason like a sword to fight despair, now he embraced the quiet breath between thoughts, the space where grief could speak without demand for swift answers. His questions remained. They were companions, not foes. Within them lay not a cry for justice only, but an invitation to listen deeper. Together they walked the edges of grief and hope, their dialogue a tapestry woven from threads of sorrow, wonder, and tentative faith. The hard edges of accusation fell away, replaced by gentle touchstones of shared experience. Each word carried weight without urgency, and each pause was a sanctuary in its own right. In the evenings, when the sun dipped low and shadows folded softly over the earth, they would sit near the fire, their faces warmed by the glow. Sometimes no words were spoken at all. Instead, the crackling flame murmured stories older than memory, and in that warmth, the presence of friendship alone became a balm for the restless soul. Job's endurance was no longer viewed through the narrow lens of trial alone, but embraced as a living testament to the complexity of faith itself. It was not a story of victory or defeat, but of steadfastness in the twilight zone of uncertainty. His journey had become a silent instruction in how to bear the weight of anguish without losing the fragile thread of trust. The friends, too, carried back to their own lives this quiet strength gleaned not from answers, but from open-hearted companionship. They understood now that the measure of wisdom is found not in the swiftness of judgment, but in the patience of seeking, in the willingness to dwell with questions that have no easy end. And so their paths diverged beneath skies soft with promise. Though weary, their spirits bore a gentle light. the kind that owes nothing to certainty, but blossoms quietly in the shared soil of vulnerability. Promises were spoken in tone more felt than heard, promises to return, to listen, to hold space for one another in whatever storms might come. Job remained, in the stillness left behind, carrying within him a durable trust that went beyond explanation. He knew now that the human heart is a vessel for mysteries too deep for swift solutions. The silence between words, the enduring presence of others, these were the true gifts of his journey. Gradually a fragile peace settled over him, but a beginning of a different kind of faith, one not built on the pillars of certainty, but on the quiet foundation of ongoing, unspeakable conversations. The struggle continued in stillness, in patience, and above all, in love unspoken yet deeply felt. And thus, the speeches of Job's friends, once a chorus of clamor and contest, softened into a hymn of companionship and hope. In the tender echo of their voices, a new story was born, one of humility, endurance, and the quiet grace found in walking together toward the unknown. In the hushed aftermath of their deep reflections, a quiet understanding settled over Job and his friends, like dew settling silently upon the earth. The air was soft around them, filled less with words now, and more with the gentle rhythm of breathing in and breathing out, as if the very land itself were holding its breath with them. Job felt this subtle shift keenly. The ache within, though still present, was now bordered by something softer, a fragile stillness that invited him to simply be. No longer did he feel the urgent need to wrest answers from the shadows. Instead, he sat with the mysteries that danced just beyond the edges of human grasp, savoring the pauses between thoughts like precious intervals of sacred silence. Bildad, once relentless in his insistence, now spoke in whispers, words as delicate as the falling leaves in autumn. He reminded them that the roots of patience often burrow deep and unseen beneath the surface before any sign of life emerges. Faith, he said, is not merely a flame to be held forever aloft, but the quiet ember that glows beneath the ashes, waiting to rekindle when the wind is right. Zophar, softened by the wonder of the unknown, shared his newfound awe of the spaces between certainty and doubt. Between what we know and what remains hidden, he mused, there is a landscape rich with possibility. Here, we do not grasp for easy truths, but rest in the open sky of not knowing, where the stars whisper of a greater design beyond our reach. Their voices wove together like a gentle breeze, carrying with it the scent of rain on dry earth. Each acknowledged that suffering did not yield simple lessons, but invited a deeper engagement with life's profound ambiguity. In this shared recognition, they found a kinship that transcended prior disputes, a subtle mosaic of sorrow, hope, and tentative faith. Evenings stretched long around the fire, and in the flickering light, silences blossomed instead of tension. Words were no longer weapons or shields, but invitations to listen, to accompany one another through shadows. The crackling flames narrated their own story, a slow dance of transformation, turning wood to ash and heat, as companionship turned despair into a space of healing. Job's endurance, now less about resistance and more about surrender, became a living testament. It was not a story of conquering or understanding, but one of steady presence, of holding on to love amid uncertainty. The friends found strength in this simple constancy, learning to live not only with questions, but with the grace of not knowing. When the time came to part, their farewells carried gentle promises, like seeds planted in soft soil. We will walk again, Bildad said softly. Through storms and silence, we remain companions. Zophar nodded, his eyes reflecting the quiet light of dusk. Together we carry the weight and wonder of the unseen. Job watched them go with a heart more open than before, a fragile peace nesting within him. He understood now that faith was less about surety and more about the willingness to dwell in the ongoing conversation, one that transcended words, rooted deeply in presence, in the shared vulnerability of human hearts. As the night deepened, Job sat alone beneath the vast canopy of stars, each one a silent witness to his journey. He let go of insistence and found comfort in the gentle whisper of the unknown, a companion more faithful than any certainty had ever been. In that space, Job's soul breathed freely, cradled by silence and the enduring pulse of love. And so the story of their speeches quieted without final answers, ending instead in a beginning. A delicate opening toward life lived with courage amid mystery, and a love that remains steadfast and unspoken. As dawn brushed the horizon with tender light, Job sat quietly, the past hours still soft and resonant within him. The fire's glow no longer flickered in the waking day, yet its warmth lingered as a reminder, not of flames that burn paths with clarity, but embers that hold steady through cooling mists. In this silence, Job's heart moved gently toward a fragile hope, subtle as breath on the skin. No longer was there a need for loud declarations, nor for swift judgments. The weight of suffering, once sharp and isolating, now felt like shared soil beneath their roots. Deep understanding had folded them closer, a quiet fraternity forged not by answers, but by presence. Bildad's words, though once woven with urgency, had settled like gentle moss on stones. Patience, he had said softly, is not just waiting, it is opening the soul to the slow dance of time and meaning. Those words echoed within Job's quiet mind, inviting him to lean into the rhythm of endurance rather than push against its current. Zophar's reflections on the vastness of the unknown had shifted from moments of tension to spaces of reverence. The mysterious intervals between certainty and doubt were no longer battlegrounds but sanctuaries. He had spoken with wonder of the unknown as an uncharted sky, vast and open, a place for the soul to stretch, to trust, and sometimes to rest in its own questions. Suffering, they all recognized now, was not merely a wound or a burden. It was an opening, a complicated invitation to enter life's deepest hallways, lined with shadows and light. In that passageway, kinship was born quietly, like stars appearing one by one in a deepening night. The evenings, once filled with fierce debate, softened into rituals of shared silence. Around the fire, they found themselves together without words, leaning into the stillness, letting grief and faith intertwine like vine and tree. Job's endurance itself transformed, no longer a shield to bear alone, but a tender offering of steady presence. Resistance softened into surrender, not defeat, but a quiet strength in love's unyielding embrace. It was a surrender wrapped in hope, breaking like dawn in the dim spaces of his heart. As the time came for parting, their farewells were gentle, not abrupt endings, but tender promises. They knew the storms would return, and silence would rise again, but in their leaving was the vow of companionship that stretched beyond words and seasons. Job carried a fragile peace, newly arrived and delicate as a leaf on water. Faith appeared not as a fortress to grasp, but as a shared dwelling in vulnerability, a breath held together amid uncertainty. Alone beneath the sky's vast canopy, illuminated by distant stars and quiet constellations, Job embraced the unknown as a faithful companion. There were no resolutions waiting to be claimed, only the comfort of mystery wrapped softly around him like a familiar robe. In this openness, he discovered a gentle courage, not the loud bravado of answers found, but the quiet bravery of living with questions unending. The story that held them all concluded not with definitive lines, but with the rhythm of life moving forward, steady, uncertain, and deeply alive. Dawn had settled fully now, soft and unhurried. Job remained where he had been, seated beneath the ancient tree whose roots seemed to drink from the same earth that held his grief. The sky was pale, a watercolor bleed of colors spilling gently across the expanse. It was as if even the heavens were whispering, urging him to listen with a new kind of silence. The echoes of their parting still woven around him, like the lingering notes of a shared hymn. No thunderous proclamations, no precise answers, only the delicate threads of companionship that had been stretched taut, then slowly relaxed into a patient weaving. He felt it in the hollow between breaths, in the quiet articulation of presence. Love, it seemed, did not always demand speech. It bloomed quietly in the spaces between words, in the steady pulse of shared vulnerability. He breathed it in, the fragile hope that had begun to glow, not as certainty but as a tender ember warming his chest. The weight of suffering was lighter here, no longer a burden carried alone, but a rich, fertile soil, binding roots in kinship. His mind wandered gently, touching on the faces of his friends. Theirs had been voices rising and falling, like a slow wind. No longer adversaries, but fellow travelers who had bravely dared to speak, to stumble, and then to listen. Bildad's words came softly now to memory, patience as an opening rather than waiting, the slow uncoiling of time's stream, the acceptance of its mysteries without demand or haste. Zophar's reverence for the unknown, viewing it as a sanctuary vast and uncharted, where the soul might find rest, not in answers but in the courage to hold questions without fear. These were not teachings carved in stone, but living pathways, winding and welcoming, inviting Job to step beyond the shadows of certainty. In this quiet dawn, Job understood suffering anew, not as a punishment nor a riddle to solve, but as an invitation, an entrance to life's deepest hallways. Here kinship moved like starlight, shining where eyes were dark, and offering warmth where hearts were cold. It was not something to conquer, but to inhabit with soft feet and open arms. The rituals of silence between them had sheltered grief and faith alike, a shared altar of stillness, where words had finally yielded their place to presence. Endurance, once a solitary armor, had softened into a living offering, an open hand, steady and unwavering. As light spread slowly across the land, Job felt his own heart shift again. The journey was far from over. No vast revelations awaited, only a beginning. A beginning wrapped in uncertainty, yes, but carried on the wings of quiet love. Not the kind shouted from mountaintops, but whispered in moments of stillness and shared breath, when the world fell away and only raw, gentle being remained. With a deep, steady breath, Job rose and faced the morning. Each step forward was a promise, a movement with no guarantees but full of courage. For now he would live in this exquisite twilight, where sorrow and hope danced softly, entwined in perpetual embrace. The day awaited, and Job was ready to meet it, not with answers but with an open heart and a steady gaze toward the unfolding horizon. In the soft light of morning, Job's breath settled into a rhythm that held both weariness and a measured hope. The ancient tree's roots hummed beneath him, an unseen current tethering him to the soil, a silent witness to his quiet endurance. The earth beneath, neither judgmental nor forgiving, simply cradled all that was. He was no longer searching for answers that must be given or truths that must be revealed. Instead, he cherished the space in which questions lay unspoken. Even the silence between his own thoughts had grown gentle, capable of holding the tension of doubt without snapping or recoiling. Memories stirred softly, the voices of his friends returning not as accusations, but as echoes of their own fears and wishes. Their speeches, once too sharp, now seemed a mosaic of human striving. Bildad's steady call for patience, not as resignation, but as the act of opening one's hands, letting life pour through. Zophar's reverence for the unknown, a humble acknowledgement that some mysteries are sacred and need not be chased or conquered. Even Eliphaz, whose words were once like fire, resonated now in Job's ears as sparks of caution. Eliphaz had sought to shield Job from despair by invoking the order of things, a fragile assurance in the face of chaos. But Job saw now how these attempts, however flawed, had borne a yearning for connection, a desire to bring meaning, however tentative, to unbearable pain. Their speeches intertwined like the branches overhead, each voice a branch swaying in the same storm, bending but not breaking. And within this tapestry, Job found a new language, one crafted from grief but also from the delicate threads of understanding and compassion. He came to see that their words were not an affront, but an offer, an invitation to stand together, sometimes trembling. Beneath this immense unknown, they were companions unwilling to let silence turn into emptiness, speaking to fill the dark with shared humanity. The memory of their dialogue became a quiet ritual, a way of meeting the unfathomable with a chorus of vulnerability rather than a solo demand for explanation. This new covenant of speech and silence, held in tension, allowed Job's spirit to rest in a different way, not in certainty or conquest, but in the humility of participation. To be present with suffering without rushing to undo it was its own kind of radical courage. Suffering, Job realized, was no longer a force to overcome, but an invitation to walk deeper into the richness of life's textures, the bitter and the sweet, the luminous and the shadowed. This was not defeat, but an opening to a hidden dimension, where pain and love were not opposites, but intertwined. Beneath the branches, he felt the slow pulse of the world, steady and unremarkable, offering itself without conditions or demands. The endless sky stretched above, vast and quietly unknowing, a sanctuary for questions that had no answers but could still be held. In this space, Job's heart grew expansive enough to cradle his sorrow alongside unexpected companions. Hope, memory, faith, fragile as a leaf, yet persistent as the dawn. His gaze lingered on the horizon, where light unraveled the night's hold. Each daybreak was a quiet miracle, an ancient invitation to begin again without guarantees. The sun did not demand understanding, it simply rose, bathing the world in its impartial glow. Job rose with the slow dignity of one who has learned to move through grief without armor. His steps were measured, steady, part of a larger rhythm he had come to trust, the ongoing cycle that carried life beyond his own pain. He carried with him the transformed friendship of those who had once judged him. In his mind their speeches no longer clanged with discord, but hummed softly, a chorus of imperfect truths, vying to touch the eternal. This shifting landscape of conversation and silence, of questioning and receiving, became Job's new sanctuary, and in this sanctuary his spirit found not resolution, but a willingness to walk forward into twilight and dawn alike, with a heart neither hardened nor collapsing but open, as vast and subtle as the sky above. The journey, he understood now, was less about arriving and more about dwelling in the tension of sorrow and grace, holding the fragile balance like a breath held between two worlds. And so, with calm resolve, Job began to walk again beneath the canopy of stars that now seemed less like distant judges and more like steady companions, their light a quiet promise that even in the greatest darkness, presence endures. The speeches of his friends remained with him, like echoes left in a cavern, their voices reverberating softly in the breadth of his new peace. In their imperfect striving, he heard the music of human hearts reaching toward each other, and toward the mystery that enwraps all life. With a gentle exhale, Job stepped forward into the day, a day not of certainty, but of openness, not of knowing, but of being. A day cradled in silent grace, woven with threads of sorrow and hope, carried by the whispering wind beneath an endless sky. As the evening sky gave way to night's deep velvet, Job sat beside the fading embers of their fire. The air was cool, filled with a quiet that welcomed reflection. Though his friends had spoken their truths and doubts, the room held no sense of finality, only the stirring of voices yet to be fully understood. After moments of silence, Bildad, the steadfast, chose to speak. His voice was steady but carried the weight of conviction rooted in tradition. He reminded Job gently that the ways of the world often followed what had been handed down through generations. Righteousness was met with blessing, and wandering from that path invited hardship. Bildad's words were firm, yet not without a trace of compassion. They portrayed a vision of justice that sought to restore order through certainty. Job listened with an openness he hadn't always managed before. He saw in Bildad's certainty the yearning for meaning and connection, the desire to grasp the elusive threads of fairness that stitch together human experience. Though Job's own suffering challenged the neat lines of cause and effect, he recognized that Bildad's perspective was another attempt to reach out. With the night deepening, Zophar spoke next. His tone was sharper, more urgent. He urged Job to abandon any notions of innocence he clung to, warning of deeper consequences if repentance and humility were not embraced. His words struck a harder note, driven perhaps by frustration or fear, yet beneath them lay a wish for Job's restoration, however sternly expressed. Job, receiving Zophar's speech without anger, felt again the complexity of their gathering. Each friend offered a voice shaped by their own experiences and beliefs, revealing less about Job's guilt or innocence, and more about their collective human struggle to find light amid shadow. In the quiet that followed, Job's thoughts turned inward, not to counter his friends' words, but to give space to his own truths. He realized that suffering was not a riddle to be solved, but a presence to inhabit. It was a vast landscape where sorrow and hope grew side by side, like wildflowers in a rugged field. The dialogue continued, not as a battle to win, but a shared exploration. Each friend brought pieces of a mosaic too large for any one person to complete. Eliphaz with his visions of cosmic harmony, Bildad with the strength of tradition, Zophar with a call to repentance. All were part of Job's journey toward quiet understanding. As dawn's first light brushed the horizon, Job felt a gentle lifting within. Not a cure nor a conclusion, but a soft invitation to remain present, to hold pain gently and accept the unknown. The stars faded, but their companionship lingered, a silent witness to this enduring human quest. He looked toward his friends, their faces marked by concern and hope, and knew that their imperfect chorus was a blessing. In their words, in their silences, they had formed a fragile sanctuary amid chaos. Job rose slowly, steady in his steps. The path ahead was unwritten, but no longer lonely. With hearts intertwined through suffering and compassion, they would continue together, walking a fragile line between doubt and faith, despair and peace. The speeches of Job's friends had carved a space where the sacred and the sorrowful met. Here, Job learned that the truest comfort was not found in answers, but in shared presence, an invitation to endure, to listen, and to love through the night. As the day unfolded, Job found himself enveloped in a quiet attentiveness. The voices of his friends, their earnestness, their misunderstandings, their longing for clarity, hovered in his mind like echoes across a still lake. He felt no rush to untangle the threads of their arguments, nor to offer something definitive. Instead, he embraced a gentle listening that folded around his pain, neither dismissing it nor demanding answers. Late in the afternoon, a subtle shift came with the warmth of a fading sun. Job noticed how the light bent softly on the dust and leaves, and in that subtle moment, his heart stirred with a fragile grace. Here was life in its relentless unfolding, not neat or tidy, not bound to certainty, but suffused with the steady pulse of being. He accepted this fragile gift, tender and impermanent. The evening arrived quietly, drawing shadows that moved with a slow rhythm. Job settled again beside the glowing embers of the fire. His eyes traced the sparks as they drifted, each a fleeting flicker of light in the darkness. He thought of his friends and the truths they sought, the ancient wisdom Bildad invoked, the stern appeals of Zophar, the weary hope behind their voices. These were facets of a shared humanity, imperfect but real. Job felt the weight of their speeches without feeling pressed to refute or assent. Instead, he took their words as part of a larger chorus, one that did not resolve into harmony, but rather embraced dissonance as part of the whole. In that space, Job found a quiet measure of peace, an understanding that life could not be reduced to simple cause and effect. Night deepened, drawing silence around him, yet even in the quiet, the presence of his friends lingered like a soft current beneath the still surface. Their concern, their love, their confusion, it all mingled with his own presence, forming a tapestry woven from struggle and grace. As stars began to kindle in the sky, Job's thoughts turned inward. He did not seek grand revelations or cosmic verdicts. Instead, he felt a subtle invitation to dwell fully within the mystery, to remain open to suffering without capitulation, to carry doubt alongside faith. In this tender holding, he sensed something akin to hope. Time passed with the gentleness of a slow breath. Job felt himself less like a contestant in a debate, and more like a traveler resting momentarily before continuing onward. He recognized that his friends shared the journey, even if their steps faltered or diverged. Their imperfect speeches were not barriers, but bridges, attempts to meet across the gulf of pain. With this recognition came a softening of Job's heart. He saw that their judgments masked their own fears, their own desires for meaning and justice. And he too harbored these longings, even as the shadow of loss stretched wide. In that shared human searching, an unseen bond held them together. Fragile, yes, but real. The night stretched on, and Job's eyelids grew heavy. As he leaned into the quiet, he felt a subtle unburdening. The need to grasp or to answer dimmed, replaced by a calm acceptance of not knowing. In that release, he found a small measure of rest. When dawn brushed the sky soft and tentative, Job awoke with a tender readiness. He rose slowly, feeling the steadiness of his feet on the earth beneath him. The journey remained uncertain, the questions loomed still, but he carried within him a renewed capacity for patience, for presence, for listening, to himself, to his friends, and to the vastness around them. He stepped outside into the gentle light, breathing in the freshness of morning. The world held no easy answers, but it offered a fragile sanctuary nonetheless. As Job looked toward the horizon, he felt the quiet blessing of being here, wounded, searching, yet profoundly alive. In this sacred space between pain and hope, Job understood the value of their shared ordeal. Not as a contest of reason or righteousness, but as a sacred encounter with the deepest truths of human existence. The speeches of his friends, imperfect and earnest, were part of this encounter, threads woven into the fabric of a larger story. And so, with a heart tender but steady, Job set forth again, not to conquer his suffering, nor to defeat his doubts, but to move forward with compassionate courage. to walk the path of mystery alongside those who loved him, balance between despair and peace, between silence and speech, between the seen and the unseen. In the unfolding chapters still to come, Job knew the journey would continue, with new questions, with fresh sorrows and unexpected gifts. But for now, in this moment of quiet dawn, he rested in the delicate harmony of presence, a fragile sacred grace. And in that grace, the story breathed on. The morning air was soft and cool as Job made his way across the quiet fields. The light brushed the tops of the grasses, weaving gold and green in gentle ripples. With each step, the earth felt steady beneath his feet, a subtle reassurance amid the swirling questions in his mind. He did not rush. There was no urgency to escape the unknown or to force answers where none had yet come. Instead, he walked slowly, letting the simple movements ground him. The speeches of Bildad and Zophar still echoed quietly within him. Their voices, though flawed and at times sharp, held an earnestness, a striving for meaning which neither could fully grasp. In their words lay more than accusation. There was a trembling fear, a hope to restore order in a world that had been unsettled. Job understood this deeply now. They were not enemies, but fellow travelers, each weighed down by the heavy burden of pain and the search for justice. In the mingling light of dawn, Job found a place beneath a lone tree, its branches reaching outward as if to shelter the morning itself. Folding his hands loosely in his lap, and let his thoughts drift softly, without strain. The judgments of his friends no longer pierced like arrows. They had softened, taking on the texture of distant, imperfect melodies, seeking harmony. A quiet peace grew within him, a fragile, tender peace born not from certainty, but from acceptance. He saw that to live fully was to hold these contradictions, trust and doubt, suffering and resilience, despair and hope. Nothing in the world was simple, no truth wholly pure or free from shadow, and perhaps it was in this very complexity that life's sacred mystery was found. The wind moved gently through the leaves above, making a steady whisper. Job listened to this quiet song, feeling it flow through him like a calm tide, washing away the sharp edges of grief. He realized that his friend's speeches, despite their imperfect reach, were part of the same longing that beat within his own heart, a longing to be seen, to be understood, to find meaning when meaning seemed elusive. As the morning stretched onward, Job's thoughts turned inward yet again, not toward defense or rebuttal, but toward compassion. For Bildad, whose stern words concealed fear, for Zophar, whose harshness revealed his own wounded hopes, and for himself, caught between silence and speech, between trials and the tender spark of life still burning faintly inside. The day unfolded slowly, each moment marked with a gentleness that seemed almost sacred. Job felt the weight of his ordeal, but alongside it a deepened courage, a readiness to walk forward even without clear answers, holding both pain and grace in his open hands. There was no need to conquer suffering or to solve its riddles too swiftly. Instead, he would learn to dwell within the questions themselves, inviting them to shape him, not break him. As the sun rose higher, touching the land with warmth and light, Job noticed how the world continued, indifferent yet alive with subtle beauty. The sparrows flitted among the branches, the distant hills wore their quiet grandeur. Life breathed around him in gentle rhythms, steady and unyielding. In this awareness, Job's heart softened. He saw that his friend's speeches, so often harsh and unyielding, were not meant to wound, but to reach out in shared vulnerability. Their words were clumsy and fragmented attempts at truth, reflections distorted by pain and fear, yet still sincere. This insight brought a subtle release. Job understood that the journey was less about proving or defending than about listening deeply, to others, to himself, to the unpredictable unfolding of time. By embracing this openness, he found a calm strength rising quietly, not from resolution, but from the humility of not knowing. Even so, Job did not abandon hope. It remained like a faint star barely visible through the morning haze, a steady point to guide his steps. This hope was not a promise of avoidance from suffering, nor a certainty of restoration, but a trust in endurance, in continued presence despite loss. As afternoon gathered, Job's thoughts turned once more to his friends. He wondered how they might come to see beyond their rigid assumptions, how they might find a way to hold both justice and mercy in trembling balance. It occurred to him that perhaps this was the work awaiting them all, a slow, quiet opening to the greater depths of mystery. With this thought, Job rose from beneath the tree and began his walk back to the hearth. There the fire awaited, unchanging even as the seasons turned. It was a familiar anchor in the shifting current of time and emotion, a place where stories could be shared, truth could be pursued with humility, and the fragile grace of human connection might be found. Evening settled gently once again. The stars emerged, soft points of light in the vast darkness, patient and enduring. Job looked upward, feeling a kinship with the silent sky, vast and enigmatic, yet always present. In the stillness of night, his heart whispered a quiet vow, to move forward with steady courage, to listen with an open spirit, and to remain tender toward both himself and those around him. He would carry their shared suffering as a sacred trust, a forging fire that shaped new depths within their souls. Though the path ahead was uncertain, Job no longer feared the darkness. Instead, he embraced it, knowing that within its folds lay the possibility of growth, renewal, and an ever-deepening presence in the unfolding story of life. In the light of this acceptance, he felt a gentle repose descend, a balm weaving through the threads of his being, softening doubt, quieting turmoil. Here, in the space between questions and understanding, Job found a fragile grace that was neither victory nor defeat, but the tender heart of endurance itself. And so as dawn would come once more, Job prepared to meet the new day, not with certainty or answers, but with openness, compassion, and the humility to be part of this vast, mysterious journey alongside friends and strangers alike. In this shared human struggle, amid the endless dance of light and shadow, he found a quiet peace, and in that peace a deep and abiding hope. The night deepened softly around Job, enfolding him in its velvet stillness. The stars, distant and luminous, seemed to whisper ancient truths in silence. Though he had no clear answers, no neat solutions to ease his soul's ache, Job felt a fragile peace settle within him. The questions remained, silent, persistent companions, but no longer harried him into despair. In the quiet hearth's glowing warmth, Job's thoughts drifted towards his friends once more. Their words had come harsh, blunt as untamed wind, but now he perceived something else, something rare in certainty. Beneath their judgments was a deep desire to touch his pain, to make sense of his suffering through the lens they knew. This recognition softened the edges of his own sharp feelings. It did not excuse all the sting, nor erase the night's long shadows, but it opened a small window of empathy. Shared pain, imperfect and stumbling as it might be, still sought connection. The friends, too, were caught in their own wrestling, between justice and mercy, between what ought to be and what is. Job imagined their hearts tangled in this dilemma, as his was. Perhaps their speeches, though flawed and sometimes hurtful, were cries for hope in a dark wilderness. Job breathed deeply and held this thought close like a fragile ember in the cold. Humility, he sensed, was both an offering and a doorway. Humbling himself before mystery, before suffering, before the silent order of the universe. Not answers, but presence. Not certainty, but an open hand. Morning's light was still far off, yet Job felt himself ready to greet it with steady courage. He understood in a quiet way that endurance was not mere stubbornness, but a gentle persistence, a willingness to keep walking through the fog. The path was not clear nor promised, but it was his to live. As the night deepened, he let go of the need for final words or judgments. Instead, he welcomed the darkness as a field of renewal, a sacred space where life, pain, and hope mingled without demand. In this fragile grace, Job found his peace. Soon, the slow turning of the night would give way to dawn, and with it new fragments of understanding, new chances to listen and to speak. For now, he rested in the stillness between questions,